Morning. I had a small Drash here to go through. But before that, I wanted to thank everybody that prayed for me last week. I had to go get an MRI done, and they said there was no tumors or strokes. The only thing they said wasn't normal was the size, but he said he could read it with a magnifying glass. No, well, we have Passover coming up, and this is kind of something a friend of mine did, and I've kind of went over this. We've always heard of the 10 plagues, and we know they're against different gods. And can we put up numbers? Okay. All right. B'nai Israel set out from Ramses on the 15th day of the first month, the first day after Passover. They went out with a high hand in the sight of all Egypt. Now the Egyptians were burying those whom Adonai had struck down among them. Adonai had brought judgments on all their firstborn and their gods. B'nai Israel left Ramses and encamped at Succoth. They departed from Succoth and camped at Etham on the edge of the wilderness. They left from Etham and turned back towards Parahsa, east of Baal Zephon, and camped before Migdol. I looked online and to look up Baal Zephon, and it means Lord of the North. And the god Baal Zephon is mentioned in Ugaritic and Egyptian and Phoenician writings as the sea and storm god. And it's also interesting that they also called him the god of the north wind, okay, which is important. And we'll read on here. Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to B'nai Israel, so they turn back and encamp before Pi-Haroth, between Migdol and the sea. You are to camp by the sea opposite Baal Zephon. Pharaoh will say concerning B'nai Israel, they are wandering aimlessly in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. I will harden Pharaoh's heart, so he will follow after them. Then I will be glorified over Pharaoh along with all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am Adonai." So they did so. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his servants had a change of heart towards the people, and they said, "What is this we have done, that we let Israel go from serving us?" So he prepared his chariots and took his people with him. He took 600 of the finest chariots, along with all other chariots of Egypt, and the captains over them. Adonai hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued B'nai Israel. For B'nai Israel went out with a high hand, but the Egyptians pursued after them with all their horses and chariots of Pharaoh, as well as the charioteers of his army, and overtook them as they were encamped by the sea, besides Pi-Haroth, opposite Baal Zephon. When Pharaoh drew near, B'nai Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them. So they were terrified, and B'nai Israel cried out to Adonai. They said to Moses, "Have you taken us away to die in the wilderness because there were no graves in Egypt? Why have you dealt this way with us to bring us out of Egypt? Did we not say to you in Egypt, 'Let us alone, so that we may serve the Egyptians'? It was better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." But Moses said to the people, "Don't be afraid, stand still, and see the salvation of Adonai, which he will perform for you today. You have seen the Egyptians today, but you will never see them again, ever. Adonai will fight for you while you hold your peace." Then Adonai said to Moses, "Why are you crying to me? Tell B'nai Israel to go forward." Lift up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it. Then Bnei Israel will go into the midst of the sea on dry ground. Then I, behold, I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, and they will go in after them, so that I will be glorified. There it is the second time. Over Pharaoh and all his army, his chariots and his horsemen. Then the Egyptians will know that I am Adonai, and I have been glorified over Pharaoh, his chariots and his horsemen. Then the angel of God, who went before the camp of Israel, moved and went behind them. So the pillar of the cloud moved in front of them and stood behind them. And so came between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel. There was a cloud and the darkness over here, yet it gave light by night over there. Neither one come near the other all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. Adonai drove the sea back with a strong, and notice this, strong east wind. You can kind of check in your concordance. It's amazing how many times God's doing something and it's always the east wind. I think he brought the locusts with the east wind. He took them away with the east wind. You know, everything connected with that east wind is him. Throughout the night, and turned the sea into dry land, so that the waters were divided. And that's something I never really caught before. You know, you kind of see the cartoon one where he puts his staff out and water just parts immediately. Well, it took all night. So the waters were divided. Then Bnei Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, while the waters were like walls to them on their right and on their left. But the Egyptians pursued and went in after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. Now it came about during the morning watch that Adonai looked at the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud, and caused the army of the Egyptians to panic. He took off their chariot wheels, caused them to drive heavily, so that the Egyptians said, get away from the presence of Israel, for Adonai fights for them against the Egyptians. Then Adonai said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the waters come back upon the Egyptians over their chariots and their horsemen. So Moses stretched out his hand over the waters, and the sea returned to its strength at the break of dawn. The Egyptians were fleeing from it, but Adonai overthrew them in the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots. The horsemen and the entire army of Pharaoh went after them into the sea. Not one of them remained. But Bnei Israel had walked on dry ground, or dry land in the midst of the sea, and the waters were like walls to them on their right and on their left. So Adonai saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. When Israel saw the great work that Adonai did over the Egyptians, the people feared Adonai, and they believed in Adonai and in his servant Moses. Now, if you could put that map up for everybody, take a minute. If you can kind of see the map, the little red dot where it starts here, and I think that's Ramses. You can see they could have easily went around all the water to where they were going. But God did this on purpose. If you can scroll down at the very bottom, this is what's interesting. When he came down here and back up, it looked like this wilderness was, they were keeping, the wilderness was keeping them locked in. But they came back down here opposite Baal Zephon. So I'm thinking Pharaoh probably thought, Israel's God couldn't part the sea or wasn't protecting them. And then when the wind came, I think he thought it was Baal Zephon holding back the waters, and that's why he went in after them. Could be wrong, but it's an interesting thought. But what you see here is it wasn't something that just happened. you know, they followed the cloud, the fire and the cloud. And this was God's purpose, to destroy Pharaoh. I mean, that's the whole thing. So it's kind of interesting if you look at it. But thank you.